Board members, if we can get you to take your seat, we'll get started. What board members are still in the building? Board members, we have two significant items left on our agenda today. The first is we're going to have our AAG David Thomas talk to us on the Open and Public Meeting Act. This is a little form of training. There'll be about 10 or so minutes, and then a few minutes for questions. So we'll turn the time over to AAG David Thomas.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. I hate to have my only real insights come from a comic strip that people don't even remember existed, but it is one of my favorites and pointed in the extreme when it comes to this particular matter. What we are here today for is because of the mandatory training which is required by statute for all public bodies, and so under the direction of our chair, this is the training which we can now check the box that we've done the necessary training with regard to the Open and Public Meeting Act. I'm going to try to focus the training to where I think are probably our weak points or the places that we are where we have the most concerns. First of all, I want you to know that there is a particular declaration of public policy within the statute which indicates that all public meetings, and we'll go into that in a minute, are subject to open and public access. And so what we're trying to do is goes to the basic matter of transparency. We're trying to be transparent in all that we do. This is to fulfill the declaration of policy within the Open and Public Meeting Act. I'm putting this up. There are penalties that are associated with failure to abide by the Open and Public Meeting Act, and they can be draconian, including Class B misdemeanors, but more importantly for our purposes is that any action that is taken by the board that is not done pursuant to the Open and Public Meeting Act is subject to being declared void by a court of competent jurisdiction, and it also would obligate us for costs and attorney's fees incurred in setting aside any of the actions. So we want all of the actions of the board to be done appropriately and ones that are enforceable, and therefore we need to follow the requirements of the statute. This is almost incomprehensible and unreadable. I'm sorry to do this, but I just wanted to put this up for the purposes of indicating these are the public bodies that are subject to the Open and Public Meeting Act. And as you can imagine, this is a comprehensive list and certainly covers the matters that are before us. The most important definition in this statute is the one is what is a meeting. And while that may sound like lawyer double talk, where you have to, well, what is the meaning of is, what is the meaning of a meeting? It is one that has certain requirements, and what it is the convening of a body. A quorum has to be present, and so in those situations where a quorum is not present, and that in many of the committee meetings we don't have a quorum present, therefore not subject to the definition of a meeting, and to discuss, receive comment, or to act on a matter. And with that, there are certain things that are not considered to be meetings. A chance meeting of, say, a quorum of the board in a chance meeting or in a social gathering, that is not considered to be a meeting for the purposes of the Act. And also there is one other one which is for administrative or operational purposes where there is no public funds appropriated, no formal action is anticipated or is taken, and is met solely for the purposes of discussion. That is not considered to be a meeting and therefore not subject to the Open and Public Meetings Act. And as we've talked before, the many times we have executive session, or not executive session, but administrative or leadership sessions for the purposes of putting together agendas. Those ones would be administrative or operational because no formal action is being taken. They are merely putting agendas together for which formal action will be taken in a subsequent meeting. Electronic meetings, we should just cover this quickly. You can have a meeting which is done electronically as long as you have an anchor location, which would clearly be this room, and it is done pursuant to the rules or ordinances of the public body. Our bylaws provide for such, and they are subject to the notice requirements which are generally applicable to the Open and Public Meetings Act. Here's the place where we are probably have to focus most of our time in the training that we're going to do today, and that is having to do with closed meetings. When is it appropriate to close? When is it inappropriate to close? And once it is closed, what is the rigor and what are the courses that we need to follow? To close a meeting can only be done in a couple of different situations. I've listed them here. This is to discuss individual character, professional competence, or physical or mental health. We've had those kind of sessions. One of the things that I have to tell you that I've been very proud of our board is that you have been disciplined in making sure that your comments stay on that and that we don't wander too far afield. With regard to talking about philosophy, as far as, general philosophy, with regard to matters that are not specifically identified as an individual's character, professional competence. There are also strategy sessions with regard to collective bargaining, purchasing of property, or other matters which would give a competitive advantage to vendors that we're associated with. Those are very carefully protected with the closed meetings. There is a place where you can discuss those kind of things and can do those appropriately. And then obviously things having to do with security and with, as I indicated, with procurement and with the purchasing of property and those kind of things. Those are matters which can come within the closed meetings. Now, with that said, one of the simple questions is, are there any meetings that must be closed? And the answer very simply is no. There's never a situation where you have to close a meeting. Even if you're going to talk about somebody's character, competency, or professionalism, you don't have to close the meeting. It is usually done so for the purposes of being able to have a free and candid conversation. It is always discretionary, so therefore it's something that we can decide not to close and not to make subject to the rigors of the Open and Public Meetings Act. With that, there are, and I'm only giving this to you as a very simple list. These are things you don't have to review. You don't have to know, and you will not be quizzed on these later. These are ones that the staff is very adroit at being able to take care of. Lorraine is terrific at knowing what the requirements of this are, as Mark, as far as making the necessary notifications. These are ones which are handled by staff to make sure that the notifications are appropriately done and that we provide the necessary information to the public. That is my presentation. How did I do? Did I come in under time?
Questions, I'm sure. Start with Board Member Cannon, and then we'll come over to this side.
So just a process question. You listed all the reasons for which we are able to go into executive session in a closed meeting. Is it necessary to specify exactly what the topic is of those meetings? Like, we're going in to discuss litigation or we're going in to discuss sale of property.
It is, and that's for the purposes of the minutes. Whether the minutes of the closed session are supposed to be kept, and also what they do is that by notifying the public as to what you're going in to the closed session for, is that there is a way, if somebody wants to challenge that closed session to say you did not stay within the parameters of the Closed Meeting Act, we have notified and provided notification as to what we're going into the closed session for, and then have to be able to hold to that rigor to make sure that we don't go aside or outside of the parameters that we've established. That way, it's much like belts and suspenders. We tell them what we're going to be doing, then we stay within that. Therefore, we can't be challenged, and the subject matter of the Closed Meeting Act won't be subject to review.
Board Member Stokes?
I'm going to yield my time.
Oh, no, I didn't know you had one.
No,
Okay. Board Member Stokes or Vice Chair Ellis, one of the other of you.
Can you go back to the slide that shows what a meeting is? So it says in there, so the next one, sorry.
Yeah. Oh, do you want me with the list?
Yeah, the list.
Yeah, okay.
No, the one that said, yeah, receive comments.
Yeah, okay, let me go back to, this is the exact statute, so you can
Okay.
read that and you can see it says, for the purpose of discussing, receiving comments from the public about or acting upon a matter over which the public body has jurisdiction or advisory power.
Well, I have some concerns about email communication between the full board. And so often we receive public comments and then sometimes board members will reply all. And I think it could be argued if we were to get a quorum of people going back and forth like that, I think that we need a little bit of training on what's appropriate there in email communication. I was told by Auditor Dougal it would be best if we were blind copying the full board if we wanted them to see communication, but not necessarily so that if we're replying all, it's not. Anyways,
Let me jump to,
because it could be argued that we're having a board discussion.
Excellent, and that's very adroit for you to kind of pull those pieces together. Let me turn to this slide where it says the chance meeting or a social gathering. If you have an opportunity where you're saying, look, I'm going to have the whole board over and then we're going to discuss things, and a social gathering turns into a discussion of policy or matters for which the board has jurisdiction over, it can be argued that that is a public meeting that is subject to the Act because you have now circumvented. In other words, you're now taking advantage of an exception to try to do that. And if you do that, that is usually can be challenged and saying that you've now violated the Open and Public Meetings Act. So if you are now initiating, say, a conference call, and you're saying, well, here, let's get a couple more people on. Now with our electronics, we can get, you can easily conference 10 or 12 people on. That would be a subversion of the Open and Public Meeting Act and would not be appropriate. So if you have the intention of having a discussion but doing it in a way so that you're not meeting the requirements of the Act, that can be a violation. In the context of an email exchange, if you are now engaging in a conversation with regard to and including the whole board, I think it could be argued to say, is the intent of that to try to arrive at some kind of a decision or to have a discussion which otherwise should be held in public? And I think this is where the rigor should become, and again, that's why I started off with the great wisdom of Pogo. The greatest enemy is ourselves. What are we doing? What is our intention? And so if your intention is to engage the whole board in a discussion, then that's something that you should say, we have an appropriate place to do that, and so I'll withhold. But if you're talking with another member of the board, you don't necessarily have to do that. But if your intention is to influence the whole board in that kind of a conversation, then we're back to this basic proposition.
Well, sorry, I don't know. I don't want to implicate anyone because I think we just need training, but there has been some emails that have said, I'd welcome anyone's thoughts, and I think that could very easily be argued that you're trying to open up a full board discussion.
And I think that in that situation, again, the training would be, and if you're sensitive to that, and it would be great, I would be delighted to discuss that with you in the next board meeting. Let's put it on the, let's suggest that leadership put it on the agenda. And at that point, then the rigor comes back in again, that we are self-policing rather than having somebody to try to say, shake a finger and say, no, you can't do that. This is a place where you say, wonderful idea, let's have a full discussion of that. And I think that there are many that have indicated that kind of an approach.
Board Member Lisa Cummins.
I just have a request, if you could. Dave, if you could put your slides on board docs.
I've sent them to Lorraine.
Oh, you did?
She's done that.
Oh, okay, because it wasn't on here, so I just would like to see that. Thank you.
That's no problem. Thank you.
Okay, any further questions or comments? But appreciate you and keeping us in line and this training. I believe the same training or similar trainings taken place over at USBA conference too, if someone wants to get more of that and grab one of those sessions. I believe it's on their agenda.
Good.
It usually is annually. So thank you. Okay, next up is the feedback on the initial draft of our ESSA plan. Superintendent Dixon, do you want to introduce who you're bringing up and maybe the intent and purpose of this, how important this study session item is, and what we're going to do with this when we're done?
Yeah, so thank you to those board members who have stayed the course and stayed around, because we really need your eyes on these items, your best thinking, and then come next month, we'll need your direction. Deputy Superintendent Patty Norman, Policy Advisor Tiffany Stanley, and Public Information Officer Emily Wheeler will be here to, almost forgot that last name, Emily, sorry, will be here with you to take you through a couple of slides that will give you some background, including the highlights about our timeline, the feedback that we have received thus far, and then what is expected of us. We will need decision points before turning in our plans, so we really appreciate you being here because it's a really important study topic.
Before you dive in, there's some decision, you got some decision points.
I'll get to those.
Okay, and then when will those decisions be made?
Since this is a study session, it's not a time for action, but we will come back to you next month and hopefully on the regular board agenda pending leadership's approval, and ask for a motion and some decision points.
Thank you, Superintendent.
And while we're getting it up, we have put the document on board docs, so you can access it that way too.
Joel Wright has joined via phone.
Hello, Joel.
Hey.
Okay, thank you.
Now, you're via phone, but are you streaming so you can see the presentation, or are you listening?
I will be momentarily.
Okay.
I'm trying to pull it up too.
Deputy Superintendent Patty Norman. We'll go ahead and start the ESSA state plan update. Realizing that, first of all, our response to the ESSA plan was one in which we just made the minimum requirements. So we reported to the minimum requirements. Thank you. And what was statutorily required. So we're going to go over some of the updates, where we're at, and then what the expectations are for where we need to be going. Again, this is a decision making. We need to know what needs to happen next, and so kind of listen with that in mind as the questions come along the way. The first is be able to tell you what this brief session is today, and really thank you for being able to be here. The first will be a procedural update, and then we'll go over what the U.S. Department of Education feedback is, both the department's feedback and the feedback feedback from the peer review. And then we'll go over what the key substantive changes or issues may be within it and how we might want to respond. So that would include all schools in the accountability system. The second would be ensuring all students have equitable access to effective educators. And the third substantive change would be 95% assessment participation rate requirements. So in moving to where we're at, on September 8th, this board approved the Utah State ESSA plan, and then we submitted it to the U.S. Department of Education on September 18th. After that, we waited, and during that time, we had different peer review occur in Titles 1, 2, and 3, and for the McKinney-Vento. We also had some peer review that happened, and then when the U.S. Department of Education's feedback came on December 14th, they gave us till December 29th to respond. We wanted to be able to take it to the board and go over these findings before any decisions were made and look for direction from all of you before we went and did the update, which is going to be required to be in on February 14th. Which is the time frame of us looking at it now, asking for these ideas and direction, and then coming back to you with those changes in February to be able to submit that final on February 14th. So with that in mind, there's two types of feedback that were given. One is the feedback letter from the U.S. Department of Education, and that feedback letter is those issues that are statutorily required, and there was no subjectivity to them. They tried to be very maintain what was being asked for every single state, so that if they said something to one state, for example, the 95% participation rate, which they told Colorado they needed to address, they also told the state of Utah they needed to address. So they tried to be very clear in saying if it was required for one, it was required for all. The other is the peer review notes. The peer review, the U.S. Department of Education had different entities that would go through our plan, and as they went through the plan, they looked for key items. Then all of that review was sent back to the U.S. Department of Education, well, to the peer review. A panel looked over it, and as they looked over it, they came with one collaborative document. The document was not a consensus document. It really looked at all of the stakeholders that gave the peer review, and then that peer review was given back to USBE, and with that, we can look at it and see those aren't changes we have to make. That's just feedback for us to look at and decide if we would like to make changes on that feedback.
Patty, if I may, Chair. Just if you could clarify who the peer reviewers were. Sometimes we think of peer reviewers and we might think of it as other states, but they were actually organizations, kind of nonprofit think tanks. So
we had Bellwether and Fordham and
just a clarification there were associations and organizations like Bellwether, Fordham, and others who chose to independently review and rate plans just to get their stamp on it and, you know, publish those ratings. There's a separate peer review process that's required by the ESSA law, and those are experts that the department convened. And the peer review and the department feedback are posted to your board docs. But yeah, the peer review are just suggestions for clarification to the plan. The department feedback is what we're required to respond to.
Thank you, Tiffany. Yeah. All right. And moving to the next slide, some of the examples, it fell into three different categories. One is things that they would like for us to clarify. Another is areas where they'd like for us to provide supplemental information. And the third category that they would like to, that they had was to reorganize information. In that first category of clarification, one was an example of this is the school selected. They wanted to know if our self-reported indicators could be determined or factored into our accountability system. And so the clarification on that was no, we're not putting those self-selected indicators into the accountability system. Providing supplemental information, they wanted more information on explaining how points could be allocated for student learning growth. On that, when we send back the revised plan, we would just give that additional documentation, which we had, and then just give them that documentation so that they have it to look at. The third is in the reorganization of information. One of the things that we weren't really aware of was that each section needed to be complete on its own. Our original understanding is that someone would read through the entire plan, and then if you had it in one area, then they would know to have it in another area. But even if it was referred back to, they would like for us to have each area complete. So that kind of speaks to part of the reorganization. Also, the description of the accountability system, having us describe the lowest quartile indicator within growth of all students indicator as a separate weighting, and the graduation rate as a separate indicator.
Okay, so I guess I already have spoken, but I should introduce myself. Tiffany Stanley, Policy Advisor with the board. So now we want to walk you through the more substantive feedback, the feedback that may require a policy decision from you. So there's really three main issues. One is the inclusion, the requirement in ESSA to include all schools in the accountability system. The other is relates to equitable access to effective educators, and the big one is this 95% participation rate requirement issue. I did also want to highlight one other issue, just to bring to your attention, even though it doesn't require a policy change necessarily. So the department has requested that we include the grading scale for the letter grade system outlined in state law to fully describe our system of annual meaningful differentiation. Our approach in describing our accountability system has been to include only what's in state law to give the board maximum flexibility moving forward. So the actual grading scale is not in state law. That was delegated to the board to determine what that would look like by going through that standard setting process. So that's an area where we're hoping to only to include the grading scale, but indicate that it's only for the 17-18 school year to kind of maintain some of that flexibility moving forward, and hopefully that'll suffice. But that's just an example of something that may not require a decision, but where we're trying to ensure flexibility in the way that we're responding and kind of the approach. So this first issue I'll just breeze over because the Standards and Assessment Committee discussed this earlier, and we will be doing a lot of work between now and February to try to come up with a recommendation for the board. But I should probably just describe at a high level what the issue is. ESSA requires that all public schools be included in the accountability system unless an accountability determination cannot be made. So the example that they give is like P2 schools. Our practice in the past has been to exempt some schools and include them in an alternative accountability system. So things like alternative schools have been handled that way. There have been challenges with that approach, as many of you are aware, over the past couple of years. So inconsistent application due to a lack of a clear definition of alternative schools. And another issue has been the fact that it excludes them also from school improvement identification. So we will need to be a little bit more specific in our plan. The department, our response currently just repeats the state law, which gives us the authority to the board, the authority to use different weightings and indicators for schools that serve special student populations. And we just said that the board may do this, but they're requesting a little bit more specificity or assurances that all schools will be included in the accountability system unless a determination cannot be made. So that's what we'll be doing over the next month, is trying to figure out a recommendation. But this has been an issue that's been ongoing for years in Utah, of not being quite sure how to handle alternative schools. So it's not necessarily something that is being propelled only by ESSA. It's something that we've been struggling with for years, I think. So, any questions?
Questions from board members? Board member Lisa Cummins.
P2 schools, are they secondary or are they alternative schools like charter and private and all of that?
Oh, P2 schools, sorry. So that's like preschool to second grade schools, so schools that don't have a tested grade. So that's the example that the ESSA law gives, as far as schools where an accountability determination cannot be made because they don't have assessed students. We don't have a lot of those, actually, but we do have alternative schools. And the challenge there is that some of those are 11th, 12th grade, and those are also essentially non-tested grades besides ACT. So.
Do you have a follow-up?
Please. Theoretically, could charters that have high opt-out rates, could they then be considered a P2 school? Preschool. Oh, to second grade. Okay, I have to think.
Okay.
Okay. I'm not seeing any other comments, so please continue.
Okay, so this next issue we wanted to make the board aware of relates to a question in the state plan template related to equitable access to effective educators. And the issue at play here really relates to data availability. So the actual ESSA requirement is that each state plan describe how low income and minority children enrolled in schools assisted under this part, which is Title I, Part A, are not served at disproportionate rates by ineffective, out-of-field, or inexperienced teachers. And then also to describe the measures the state will use to evaluate and publicly report on this information. So the issue really is this requirement to report on ineffective teachers. We have the data on out-of-field and inexperienced. The data on ineffective is a little bit more challenging. So why doesn't the state have educator effectiveness data currently? So school districts are not required to report educator evaluation ratings to the state currently. So they're not collected in a uniform way. Charter schools also are not subject to the state law that requires districts to conduct educator evaluations and use a certain structure and format. So the four levels and all of that, they're not subject to those requirements. And then another piece is that some states have used student learning growth as measured by statewide assessments as, a proxy for effectiveness. But state statute here prohibits the use of statewide assessments in educator evaluation, so it would be a little bit contradictory to go ahead and use that for this purpose when our state law doesn't allow that. So our proposed approach would be to require all local education agencies to report educator evaluation data as a condition of receiving title funds. And then in order to allow for comparability and to be able to report this data, we would also need the data from charter schools. So in board rule, we could require that charter schools report educator evaluation results using the 4-point system, currently required of districts, but continue to allow charter autonomy in what the whole rest of the educator evaluation system looks like.
Just one sec.
I just want to add a piece to this, that by virtue of the charter application, they do have educator evaluation as part of their charter, as part of their application. It just is not beholden to 53.8A or our board rules. So for anybody listening in, I just don't want it to appear that they don't engage in educator evaluation. They do, but it's very independent of their charter.
Right. So, and then also, since the state or the law requires us to also report the information, to just specify that our plan would be to report at the state level the percentage of educators categorized in each of the categories that are required to be reported, and then report on school accountability report cards the teacher qualification data. So that's the years of experience and percentage of educators in each LEA who are qualified, but not the effectiveness data at the school level, just the qualification. Any questions or input on that approach?
I'm not seeing any. Please continue.
Okay, so the 95% participation rate requirement. The issue here really is conflicting policies. So what is the ESSA requirement that the department has required us to respond to in the template? So I'll just read it. Essentially, for the purpose of measuring, calculating, and reporting on the achievement indicator, so not all indicators, not the growth indicator, but on the achievement or proficiency indicator in the accountability system, include in the denominator the greater of 95% of all students, or 95% of all students in the subgroup, or the number of students participating in the assessments. So what could that actually look like? It helps to actually go through an example. So I'll go through an example of a school with a participation rate of less than 95%, because that is when this provision would apply. If you have a participation rate greater than 95%, then it wouldn't affect the school. So the school has 100 assessed students, 120 enrolled students, so a participation rate of 83%. The current methodology that we use right now to conduct accountability calculations would, if they had 65% of their students scoring proficient or above, that would go in the denominator. In the numerator, in the denominator, you would have just the assessed students. So as seen on the previous slide, that would be 100, so their proficiency rate would be 65%. With the ESSA methodology, what would change is that you would need to include the 95% of enrolled students in the denominator. So 95% of 120 about is 114. So their proficiency rate, the proficiency rate using the ESSA methodology would be 57%. So you can see how it would have an impact if you have an opt-out or a participation rate that's below 95%, and in this case, 83%. So what is the state law that conflicts, really? It's this provision, which is that the board shall make rules to prevent negative impact to the extent authorized by state statute to an LEA or an LEA's employees through school grading or the accountability system due to a student not taking a test due to the parental opt-out provisions. So we also took a look at, so that was an example, just a hypothetical example, but we took a look at the impact to Utah schools of applying this methodology. as I mentioned, the accountability scores for any school with a participation rate below 95% would be affected, and that is about 30% of our schools have, so about 6% have a participation rate below 85%, and about 24% have a participation rate between 85 and 95. But what would the magnitude of those impacts be, right? Because they may be right under 95%, in which case we're talking about 1% or so difference, and how big of an impact will that really have? At a system level, because 70% of schools actually have a participation rate above 95%, the impacts may be relatively small. So the state proficiency rate would decrease, this is an estimate, about 3 percentage points by calculating assessment or the proficiency rate or in this way, which is big or small depending on how you want to look at it. But then the achievement points earned through the accountability system for elementary schools would decrease just about 0.5%. So on average for the whole system, elementary schools, 0.5%, that's not a huge impact. For high schools, on the other hand, since we do know the opt-out rates tend to be higher in the high schools, the impacts are a little bit bigger, but around 2.5%, so still not huge. That being said, schools with low participation rates would be disproportionately impacted. So schools with a really high, opt-out rate would see huge swings in at least the calculation for the achievement indicator, and I'll show you a specific example of that. But here, so what schools may be disproportionately impacted? Charter schools have about twice as high of opt-out rates or as school districts, and then virtual schools as well. So actually the maximum participation rate for virtual schools is 65%. The minimum is 5%. The average is about 36% for virtual schools. So virtual schools would be that's where you'd see these huge swings, which I can show here. So the point here is that it's possible that by doing the calculation in this way, which again only affects the achievement indicator, not the whole system, could impact the schools that are identified for school improvement. So this chart, we just looked at using the ESSA methodology, the proficiency rates, as well as using our current methodology, the proficiency rates, and seeing the difference. And the highlights are the schools that would be in the lowest 3% for the achievement indicator only. So the lowest 3% according proficiency rates in the state. And then the white, the non-highlighted schools are those schools that are suddenly in the lowest 3% for proficiency rates because of the way, by calculating it in the new way, right? So most of those schools are virtual schools. So all these non-highlighted schools, you can see 5 rows down. Their current proficiency rate is 43%. Their new proficiency rate would be 3% because they have such a high opt-out rate that including all those students as zeros essentially instead of unknowns would result in a proficiency rate of 3%. So that really swings what schools end up in that lowest 3%. But again, this is just for the achievement indicator. This isn't for the entire system, but this gives you an idea, especially in those schools that have such high opt-out rates, how it could affect the system. Okay, so options to address this issue. We could maintain 2 parallel accountability systems, essentially, by calculating proficiency rates using the state methodology for the state report card and the ESSA methodology for the federal report card. And then identify schools for improvement based on both methodologies. So a school may be identified for improvement based on the federal methodology, which includes this adjustment for participation rates, and schools would also be identified for using the state methodology. And Emily is going to go into details on these, but just at a high level wanted to lay out the options for you. Oh, yeah.
Just to clarify, so when you say you have two accountability systems for two identifications, so the state would be identification for the state turnaround, and the federal accountability would be identifying students for the Title I school improvement. Is that correct?
Essentially, and what it really could look like is that you would produce a report, and Emily can go into more detail, but you would produce a report that includes the proficiency rates calculated using the ESSA methodology, and sort of diminish that report. But the federal law does require that we identify schools based on that methodology. And so there may be some schools that we haven't identified over here that fall into the criteria to identify because of that, the way that it's done on the ESSA side.
Okay, a follow-up, and then I think Joel's trying to get on, but Vice Chair Brittany Cummins is speaking now.
So when you say identified, that's only for the school improvement dollars that are from the federal government. Is that correct? It's not identification to receive state turnaround funding. Is that what I'm understanding? So they would be siloed into very specific identification, therefore funding sources. Is that correct?
Essentially, I think there's still flexibility to not double identify. But any school that would be identified over here in the federal land would need to take those required actions and receive school improvement funds, federal funds.
Board Member Wright, were you wanting to engage? You have a question? Apparently not. I think we're good. Okay, please continue.
So the other couple of options would be if the desire is to seek to maintain one accountability system. So you could submit a request to waive this particular statutory provision, this 95% issue, or we could indicate in our state plan that we cannot comply with this provision. So I'm going to hand it over to Emily to kind of walk through what those options will look like.
All right, so sorry. Looking at option one, if we wanted to maintain the two parallel accountability systems, we have some high-level disadvantages and advantages that we've come up with. This is not completely inclusive of everything, of course, but some of the disadvantages would be sending conflicting messages about the performance of schools, which we have dealt with as a state and we had hoped to get away from. The inconsistent messaging just overall would be an issue, and we would also have to deal with some internal inefficiencies in creating two parallel systems at one time. The advantages, of course, we'd be playing by the rules of the department, and we do not anticipate being a test state if we go with this option. We believe Colorado will likely apply this option for because they received the same feedback that we did. And what we've been led to believe is that they're going down this route. So if the department approves what Colorado is doing, they would presumably need to approve what we were doing too, and we would be the second state to ask for this.
Oops. Chair?
You bet. Board Member Lisa Cummins.
What do you mean test state. So would Colorado sue?
Oh, so think of it like a guinea pig state. So we wouldn't be the first state that the federal government had to decide what to do with.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is if we went down this route, we would test the federal government on how far they would go in.
This one we wouldn't. Because Colorado is already going down this route.
But we would be the second, third, whatever other number we are behind Colorado.
That's anticipated. Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah. Okay. If we went down this route, we would have a list of to-do items. One of them would be to communicate the strategy to explain that although we hope to eliminate 2 accountability or more accountability systems, the provision in ESSA has prohibited us from doing that. And we would also need to decide how to make the state accountability system the most primarily accessible and visible, assuming that that's what the board chooses to do. And that would be the system that you would want to highlight.
Okay, we have a quick question. Vice Chair Britton, comments?
What are under ESSA, what are the reporting or publishing requirements of accountability? So if we had 2 systems, what do they ask us to do with our accountability?
So we are required to, there's specific reporting requirements. So we are required to publish a state report card and LEA report cards that include all of this information, the accountability system results, all of that, publicly report that information.
Okay, follow up?
When you say publicly, that means similar to what we have now, you'd click on the data gateway and you'd see, here's the federal report, here's the state report card. Is that what I understand?
Yeah, although that would be a decision that you could make about the visibility and where those reports would be.
Like it could be feasible that it could be an Excel spreadsheet that's just like linked to somewhere, possibly, rather than like a report card for each school kind of thing.
Any more questions? Or?
Okay, yes, there is. Board Member Stokes.
So in reality, this requires to run 2 separate systems, and it is in essence really pretend, right? I mean, we're trying to play like we're doing the right thing, while still not doing the right thing.
I think that argument would be made by some.
Yes. Okay, so I'm just skipping ahead here to the next one, which is 2B, right? The non-compliance.
Well, we have 2A, if you'd like to discuss that.
Okay, well, I'm skipping ahead to to 2B, because 2A is just asking them again, right? It's essentially, we've done a waiver right now. We have that, but we asked for a waiver before, right?
So this is sort of the tricky part with that language, because we are currently, or maybe not quite currently, but for the past few years been under a waiver through No Child Left Behind.
Right.
So a waiver from the No Child Left Behind provisions. It's interesting that in the new law they did allow the secretary and authorize the secretary to waive certain statutory provisions at the request of the state, or even LEAs can make the request. So from a specific statutory provision, if we can make the case that it will advance academic achievement in the state, they have the authority to waive specific statutory requirements. And that's the issue here, is there's this very specific statutory requirement that they're required to enforce unless we ask them to waive it.
So of the 3 options of option 2A, well, it's 1, 2A. One's already being tried with Colorado, right? I mean, that's no new ground plowed. 2A is essentially we ask for a waiver of that requirement, and that buys us a little more time to see what they say. I personally think that going with 2A coupled with some of the things you have in 2B are what we should be doing, which is going and talking to our federal delegation about why this is, so we have a backup plan. So that when we get to the point, if they deny this, which I don't think they're going to, personally, that we have already begun the groundwork to move to the non-compliance category. So I would say a hybrid of the, I'm getting them all mixed up here, but the 2A, yeah, and 2B.
The waiver and the non-compliance. Okay. Would you like us to go over some of those details of what we think might happen with those?
Sure, it's on
Yeah.
the table, so we might as well be talking about it unless you want to finish your presentation and come back, or it's your presentation and then we'll roll our sleeves up and work unless you want to roll your sleeves up now. What would be your preference?
Should we can continue and just lay it all out and then maybe
Let's lay it out and make note to come back.
Okay.
To
So
this.
as Board Member Stokes mentioned, 2A would be to submit the request to waive the statutory provision. The return or the advantages would be it would initiate a conversation among both federal and state policymakers to consider the competing policies, both at the state level and the federal level. And we would avoid the creation of the two parallel accountability systems that we mentioned before. We would need to communicate why we're doing this. We would need to draft the waiver request and facilitate a public comment period, which is required. And we would need to demonstrate why the waiving of the requirement would advance student academic achievement consistent with the purposes of ESSA. So moving on to 2B, the non-compliance option. The risk of this is that we could lose federal dollars. We have a few options that we've heard about if this happens. We could lose about $1 million. That's an approximate amount that goes towards state administration of title programs. So that would be money out of our office. The severity, depending on how much you think $1 million is worth, is somewhat high. The likelihood of this, we believe, is also high, but we're not. Go ahead, Tiffany.
Well, and just to clarify why the likelihood of that is high is that the ESSA law is explicit in that it authorizes the secretary to withhold state administration funds if the requirements of the state plan requirements are not met. It's interesting that it seems to limit it to just state administrative funds. I don't know if the AGs have had a chance to look at whether they can find anywhere where it authorizes the secretary to withhold all program funds in ESSA. Because that's what we were trying to find, is if there's in the law an authorization to withhold all program funds.
So I can add
Okay,
a little bit
go ahead,
about
Brian.
that. I had a chance to speak with Peter Zamora at CCSSO about this. He's a director regarding federal programs out in Washington, D.C., and was super helpful. He gave me some information on waiver, which I can kind of fill in member Stokes about that when we circle back to the waiver issue. But as far as the idea of withholding funds, what he told me is that if there was non-compliance by Utah with the ESSA requirement, this 95%, that we would expect an audit and there to be audit findings and a corrective action plan, which will give us opportunity to right the ship, I guess, at that time. And then, but ultimately, yes, it could result in withholding federal funds that relate to the administration and not programmatic side. He indicated it's super rare to withhold funds for the programs, but not as rare for the administration side of the programs. So that would potentially be an option that we would have to face. I don't know if that answered your question or not, but that was what I learned.
So if for some reason that did happen, the amount that we estimate would be about 90 million for Title I funds or 123 million for all title funds. If we go this route, the return would mean the same, we would have some of the same benefits as the waiver. We'd initiate the conversation between policymakers at both the state and the federal level, and we would also avoid the creation of two systems. We would need a communication strategy for this because I believe we probably would be the test state. And we would also need some support and cooperation from both federal and state policymakers to either pursue additional funds or to replace or amend. Sorry, Spencer? Okay. So to pursue withholding of funds or to replace the funds or amend the statute.
Board Member Stokes.
So we're in a weird world right now, which is a situation where we've had a change of the executive branch, but many of the people who would be kind of mid-level policymakers of, not yet been confirmed or put in place. And so you're still dealing with a group of people in the, bowels of the Department of Education that are going to want to make us a test case scenario. This is my opinion. And yes,
I agree.
Yeah, and the secretary could, certainly if it makes it up to the secretary, there may be a discussion about it, but we all know that there's probably institutional folks within the agency that would like to embarrass the secretary. This is, once again, my opinion, like to embarrass the secretary. So I don't think this is the right direction to go. I mean, it would be great if everybody were in place and we could challenge this and we could get back up but I think we ought to try the waiver first and talk to our federal delegation about why this is not, working for us. And in case we have to go to another, long game policy, but it doesn't seem efficient or effective to be running two systems like Colorado is going to try to do. And that's also still, I think, more of a poke in the eye at them than going with the just outright asking them for the waiver, but then beginning the dialogue with our state house and our federal folks.
Vice Chair Ellis.
I understand that we're under a different administration than when No Child Left Behind was created, but Senator Dayton really pushed back in our state against No Child Left Behind, which was pretty unusual at the time because she was pushing back against her own party, and the state as a whole was just starting to say we are not going to comply with these requirements coming out of the Department of Ed. And I would encourage everyone to call her and ask her to tell you this story, because we got too scared. And as a state, we finally said, sorry, we're too scared to push back against the Department of Ed. And so we complied because the Department of Ed started making all these threats. We're going to withhold all your funding for buses and all these other things. And at the end of the day, we complied. And years later, someone from that department was visiting with Senator Dayton and said we would have never held to those Because that's also national news to say that the Department of Ed is withholding $90 million or $123 million to our most at-risk students. And so I think that that's something to be considered as well, instead of always being fearful of what may or may not happen. Because, anyways, something to think about.
But I think get bombarded.
Okay. Do you have, Board Member Bolter, do you want to, where are we at? Did you want to continue? Do you have more to share? Or are we to that point?
That's pretty much all we have, but we wanted to present the options to you and recognize that next month we'll probably be asking for, well, we will be asking for some direction about what we need to do.
So can I just throw something out? This is a comment that I have on this, and I'm one that, sometimes I live in fear, but I know how important this $90+ million is to a lot of our schools. And I can go back in time a little bit, and I can remember on some of those decision makers that if we're going to put something at risk, if this board is going to choose to put something at risk, we better have a really good contingency plan of how we're going to address the consequences of that, instead of bluffing or being bold and not have that fear. And I'm just going back because I'm pretty aggressive in a lot of things that I do, but I think there is still some wisdom or something that's of value that we should consider back when our policymakers and the decision makers were making those decisions. So I think we need to be mindful of that as we're moving forward, of what might a contingency plan and what the outcomes might be, that if we do lose that, because that should be all in the waiting as we wait this decision. So, but I know, so I'm off my soapbox there a little bit, but I appreciate your work on all of these, and I think we're going to further even better discussion moving forward. I want to recognize Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
I have a question back on the teacher evaluation portion of it. And so my first question is I'm guessing all of these items have similar weight in their eyes, or are there certain topics that are more weighty than others?
So of the substantive issues that we raised, are there certain topics that are more weighty to the department?
Yep.
So my sense, based on reviewing the feedback and discussing the feedback with the department, is that their responses are always, does it comply with the statute, and applying that evenly. So they're just looking for whether or not we have fully complied with the statute, the ESSA law, and not necessarily saying this statute's more important than the other. So we really want to see you comply with this statute. I haven't seen that from the department yet.
Can I ask a couple more questions?
A follow-up.
So in that conversation of teacher evaluation, conceptually, it's kind of interesting when you think how easy that data is to just make up. It would be very easy to comply and to have highly effective teachers all over the state. And so I'm wondering if we could create or think up some type of a hybrid where it doesn't rely on teacher evaluations. And I know you talked about not using SAGE data to do that, but is there another way that we can basically say, what are the outcomes that you're seeing? And it's not always going to be the same. You can have great outcomes and a poor teacher because you have a whole bunch of really compliant children in a classroom, and you could have poor, SAGE outcomes and a fantastic teacher who is giving every moment of every day. And so I guess my question is have we really thought about other ways to measure the outcomes that we really want to see for students and have that meet this particular request or indicator, basically saying these students in this school are receiving resources, right? Because that's the question. Are they receiving adequate resources both in personnel and et cetera? And so how do we measure that in a really legitimate way that's not being made up by some HR person saying everybody's highly effective, or using raw SAGE data?
So I'm looking around because there's experts in the room that could speak to this a lot more effectively than I could. But essentially, it's how do we measure the effectiveness of educators? And my understanding of the approach has been that we have desired to use educator evaluations to measure the effectiveness of educators as opposed to just one measure. And educator evaluations include, several measures. So it may include student learning growth that's not measured by statewide assessments and observations and other things like that. But I shouldn't say much more without having somebody jump in if they want to. Diana? Okay.
Diana Sedgwick, Director of Teaching and Learning. So the definition of effectiveness is something that was up to us several years ago, and what Tiffany just described is the outcome of several years of work in designing what an effectiveness system and an evaluation system would be about. So in terms of have there been conversations about others, yeah, there's been lots of conversations about others, and what we currently have is the outcome of those. To say, would there be something else? Possibly, but that would be a redesign of something. And so where we're required to have a definition of effectiveness now, we're kind of between a rock and a hard place to use the definition that we have or something that we could create or come up with fairly quickly, which is why we talked about using SAGE data, but then really saw the disconnect between using SAGE data when we are not using SAGE data for effectiveness. I don't know if that really answers your question, but we'd be open to a great idea. We've had a lot of conversations, and we feel like the system that we have is the best.
Sorry about that. Board Member Lisa Cummins.
I was trying to look up our financial request to the governor's office and to the legislative office. Billions of dollars. Why could we not tack on another 90 million? Seriously, I mean, that's a serious question of saying we need to cover this. We need to stop playing Mother May I to a federal government that is technically unconstitutional, and say, look, we can cover these costs if we chose to. We can run these programs appropriately if we chose to. Right? We don't need to play Mother May I with the federal government telling us what to do, when to jump, and how high. Or loose state sovereignty over top of that, right? So, I mean, okay, let's play the what if game. What if we did ask for another 90 million to the legislature and say it needs to cover all of the Title Is that we would be losing through the federal government by not complying?
Well, it's certainly an option.
Yes.
And it's worthy to have that in our next, when we have all our board members and we're ready to take action as a proposed remedy
There's 8
to
here.
this, but I just want to speak a little bit to this. As a taxpayer and a businessman of multiple businesses, and I pay in a lot of money to the federal government, into the federal government, and I also enjoy having a bunch of that money come back to the states, or come back to our great state in the form of on the transportation, which is real important to us on that infrastructure. It also comes back in agriculture, to our agriculture, which is really important to the economics of our state, and then also feeding us. And the third has been in education, and I understand these hoops and that, but there are ways to navigate that moving forward. And so I'm just being vocal here that I'm an advocate. I'm still an advocate of having some of my tax dollars that I pay out come back. However,
Chair, if I may, then I would argue that we need to perhaps repeal the 17th Amendment and ask to keep our state tax dollars here within Utah.
which is a whole different discussion outside of where we're at. Board Member Bolter.
I too like having money that I pay in come back, but I have to ask myself at what cost, and how much of my freedoms and liberties and sovereignty am I willing to give up to have this money? And at what point do we say, okay, enough, we're the state of Utah? At what point do we start standing up for ourselves and say, thank you, the money is nice, but we can take care of our own?
And I believe that's kind of where we're at as we're putting this strategy together, because that's all part of the conversation. Nobody's taking that part away. Okay, we had, yes, Patty.
So I would be remiss if I didn't have this one piece, and if you'd go back one slide, maybe there's a couple of slides. If we look at what the ESSA requirement is, part of it is something that you as a board need to decide, is it something that you believe in or not, or is it something that our students need or not? Then the other part is the funding that goes along with it. So there's a requirement as to, do we agree with this requirement? Is it something that is good for the students in the state of Utah? And there's a part that comes along with it, is the funding, and how would we get the funding? So if we look at that in totality of what is being required, each state plan shall describe how low income and minority children enrolled in schools assisted under this part are not served at disproportionate rates by ineffective, out-of-field, or inexperienced teachers. And the measures that the state educational agency will use to evaluate and publicly report the progress of the state education agency with respect to such description. So in that, probably the first thing to decide upon is, what of those things are we doing currently, which we're doing all of those except for reporting the effectiveness data. But in doing so or not doing so, are we ensuring that our students that are low-income and minority children are being served at a rate with effective teachers? And so the complexity comes in being able to decide, are they being served by effective teachers? How do we know? So those are different conversations, and having that really aren't conversations. In addition to the conversation of federal money and not, is what is it that we really can ensure, and what data do we have?
Okay. Vice Chair Ellis.
Today in standards and assessment, we brought up the topic for the alternative schools accountability. And that's not quite the same as this educator effectiveness. Was this discussed anywhere today? Mm-mm. So this is just something that was being presented now, and we've got to come up with a strategy before then.
Mm-hmm. By February.
Yeah, it's too bad we couldn't have done this during a action portion, so we could come up with a plan.
Superintendent Dixon.
And the piece on educator effectiveness, we've discussed actually with the board over the course of, ongoing for several years now. And actually specifically to this, it's been discussed in prior meetings because it was a sticking point for us gathering that effectiveness data and putting it in Cactus. It was discussed in law and licensing, I don't know, starting maybe 2 or 3 years ago. The concern was, how do we gather, where do we house this data? And the board made a decision at that time to not require all of that reporting. It was part of Senate Bill 64 back in 2012. And in terms of the rule, we went a little bit beyond what was called for in statute to try and gather some of this information. So it has been an ongoing conversation with the board. We're back to that data point now of, so everyone's using those 4 terms. It's about how do we gather and report on it. But the point we haven't talked about is the forcing function for charters and having those 4 descriptors be part of their systems, whether they change their system or not, or just align their current terminology to that for reporting purposes when they report it to us. So I think from that respect, we're not asking them to completely change their system, but at least have some kind of alignment for reporting. So that's a minor function. It's in terms of the reporting. And then that data should help drive some policy decisions. For example, if we can see in several districts or charters where their schools are filled with ineffective teachers or filled, for example, with all new teachers or a lot of movement. I'm thinking of one school that was really struggling in one of our larger districts. And just out of curiosity, we pulled up Cactus data, and about half of this, well, I think it was actually more than that, 3/4 of the teachers had been there, had been teachers for 3 years or less. And we happen to know of a cohort of brand new teachers that came out of the University of Utah. There were 7 of them. And after the first year, only 1 remained out of that cohort. The district made a choice to put a brand new principal at the school, staff it with a lot of brand new teachers. And so is that you can't affect that district policy? That's a local decision. But are there some policies in place where you could somehow you could have some leverage to incent schools to be more mindful about their policies of transfers, et cetera. So the data could help you in a number of ways beyond the federal reporting. And that was the conversation that we tried to have 2 or 3 years ago, and I think came up several times in law and licensing. That is certainly not without controversy as one of the 3 points, but it's much easier for you as a board to navigate and make a decision on versus now, do we hold alternative schools to different levels of accountability, and primarily, do you choose to push back against the 2 systems or some of the elements or create a waiver? So I think that teacher piece is a little easier to deal with.
Vice Chair Brittany, comments?
So I have a couple things because this spurred thought, and I'm wondering, that was kind of the crux of my question, is there some type of a alternative? Because I can guarantee that you're not going to get a charter school or a district that's going to send up data that says we have 100% ineffective teachers. Even, do you know what I mean? They're not going to do it. It's and so I guess my question is there hard data that we could really report that where we talk about trends of information, where inexperienced teachers, you can have a brand new teacher who has all kinds of zeal and excitement, but there is a certain amount of effectiveness that comes with experience over time, right? So if you have a whole school of brand new teachers, then is that meeting this need where you are disproportionately sending inexperienced teachers into one area? And that's data, that's information that is not subjective, right? And so you can say, here's here's this, or we could talk about high transfer rates. So we can't keep a teacher for more than 2 years in a school or 1 year, because that says something, and it's data that we can use. And so that's my question is there these other ways that we can meet the intent of that particular request without saying we have to, charter schools, you have to start using these labels, or everyone has to report it consistently, because I don't know that that's really what the information that we're seeking, because I don't think it's going to make the difference, that the intent of what that's looking for.
Superintendent Dixon.
Thank you. If I could just clarify and add to that, what we do have for validity are our standards, the teaching standards, and all of our educator evaluation systems in districts have to be based on the Utah Effective Teaching Standards. So if you look at validity, certainly that point we have some data that's pertinent. The reliability then is left from LEA to LEA. How well do they assess against those standards? And that's something our office has really been working on, to certify principals with reliability. And so there are some components that are built right into your own rule and into statute that speak to educator evaluation and those components. Now, you're spot on that there's variability that we can't control for in terms of is an effective teacher based on the standards the same in Weber District as they are in Washington County. And that's what Senator Osmond, when he ran 64, or Senate Bill 64 in 2012, it was to get at the very concern that you have. We knew that, I'm kind of making this number up, it's not exact, but we knew that well over 95% were reporting as effective to highly effective. And I think most of them were highly effective. It was very skewed. So we were trying to put elements in place, and we worked very closely with UEA and other organizations collaboratively to try to put that in place. So there is an element of validity into the labels that are out there and how they're being categorized based on the teaching standards. The reliability is subject. So I hear what you're saying, but at least we have something that can be a data point.
Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, and my understanding our session here is we're asking questions. So is it okay just to kind of ask and to speak? Because I guess my my concern is it's what we get from standards is consistency. In definition, we don't necessarily get validity because of the reliability that can come out of it, right? And so so that just leads to that question of what is it that we're really trying to accomplish? Because if we just try and put a Band-Aid on something, here's our Band-Aid, is it really going to accomplish what we need? And is the Band-Aid going to cause more harm to the system than good? And I think to a certain degree, this particular topic, when we talk about teacher effectiveness and how to evaluate and report that, is one of those things when we talk about eliminating barriers and heavy rocks in boxes. This, and I'm not speaking expertly, but this might be one of those things that if we're not careful, we're going to make it too heavy to actually get the information that we want that's effective. And so that's more of a question of discussion rather than saying I've got it all figured out, because I don't. And so anyways, I would like, before our next meeting when we're making some decisions, to know if there is some other options of how we can move forward with that particular topic, so that we're not just putting a Band-Aid on something that says, here's all this data and information that may actually reduce an LEA's ability to be a good evaluator and to really make hiring decisions at the local level that are important to them. Because if you are expected to report and you've just labeled all of your teachers highly effective, how then do you create a scenario where you help a teacher to leave the profession If I'm highly effective, how can you tell me that I'm not, or that I need help, or that I need mentoring, right? And so it puts on a situation where an LEA is incentivized to create lots of highly effective teachers on paper, but not necessarily to do the work that would require an LEA to help teachers to become highly effective. So that's my concern with putting this particular Band-Aid just for reporting purposes. So, and then also just a question of, you know, as we explore different ideas of how to meet some of these needs, I guess the question of, you know, we've got option 1, 2, and 3 as far as, you know, what we can do as far as that waiver, but there's also, you know, do we want to seek some collaboration with the legislature to look at the opt-out statute and see if there's some things that could be changes to create an environment that's more conducive to students wanting to and participating in some of these tests. So that's just a thought.
Okay, we'll recognize Board Member Lisa Cummins.
Some of the reasons why parents have left the public school system and either have approached homeschool or private school or even a charter school and started their own charter and methodology of teaching is because they disagree with the standards. And so it's really whose definition are we using to judge these schools and the teachers and the students by? And I know of a charter here in Utah who is now labeled a turnaround school based on our definitions, and their kids are doing fantastic and they're going to elite schools, but the school itself is deemed as a failing school. I don't understand that. Well, I do, in that we're judging them based on somebody else's definition. And that is wrong. That is wrong. If we're going to be talking about local control, you know, and putting the authority back in the local control hands, we need to be able to trust the LEAs to know what they're doing and trust the results that are coming out of that, instead of prejudging based on our definitions that we've been given by the legislature or by us, and dictate what that looks like. I think that's unfair. And it's resulted in this situation where we're now in a mother may I with the federal government, who again is asking us to fit a square peg in a round hole, and it's not right.
Other board comment? Vice Chair Ellis.
I apologize for not knowing this off the top of my head, but the standards for what are making a teacher highly effective, are those specifically addressed in statute, or are they in board rule, the metrics that are used to determine that? Or is that a local?
I'll link those to you all right now. The Utah Effective Teaching Standards are in your board rule. Okay. I think they're referenced in a couple of places, but it just says Utah Effective Teaching Standards in statute. It doesn't name what they are, so it gives you the option to look at those and change those at any time. The latest iteration, Ms. Rowland or Diana, I can't remember the latest iteration of them, maybe 3 or 4 years ago. I don't know, but they're the ones that we developed and you passed them. 5 years now.
Well, that's when Osmond's bill was passed, roughly.
So I'll send you the link so you see.
Thank you. The reason I'm asking that is because as part of this one, I'd personally like to re-look at those before the meeting. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. Further comments? questions? So, okay, go ahead.
I think that was my question. Sorry if I were interrupting you, which is what direction do you have for us in moving forward with these three options that we can work on before February?
And if we can get that in our packets and board docs earlier, the better. Oh, well, based on the conversation, well, I've got a couple of lights on. Well, and hands up. Let's get through those, and then we'll get to the conclusion of what to do. Board Member Warner.
I just go back to Board Member Stokes' original idea of discussing a waiver and going from there. I mean, it just seems like if we could go from that point and move forward, that would be the simplest idea.
So that was an additional option to what they had. It was kind of a hybrid of.
He did.
Okay.
Just to start off with the waiver.
All right. Board Member Lisa Cummins.
Yeah, I was just going to say the same thing. Do we need to have a motion to do that?
No, we're in work session. This is just feedback, and we're trying to get a little bit of a consensus of, do we have other options that we need to explore, and what might those be, and get in our packet so that our staff is prepared for this very important meeting that we've got coming up. It's a heavy lift of what we're going to choose to do. Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
And may I suggest as well that each of those questions be clearly pulled out, so that as a board member in preparation for that meeting, we know very clearly where those decision points are. So, in regard to, because was there three? Yeah, so those three topics, it's very clear what that those are the three decisions that we need to make at our board meeting, and what those options are, I think would be very helpful.
Okay, the superintendent knows where we need to go, and I believe we've given you feedback. Vice Chair Ellis.
I'm wondering if it'd be possible for you had created a chart for the Eliminating Barriers Task Force to look at, if that could be uploaded for them to see the differences between opt-out rates and, I don't remember what was in the other column.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Vice Chair Brittany Cummins.
Sorry. The first topic of consideration, was it the alternative schools? Yes. Inclusion of all schools in an accountability system. And I guess it's making sure we understand exactly what those implications are, because I think there's other discussions happening. Yeah, with alternative schools. And so if there was anything that came from that committee's recommendation that we could tie that to this, if the conversations come together, I don't know.
Sorry, I should let the chair of the committee tell you what happened.
Oh, Board Member Cannon.
So we did have the discussion about how we have two alternative systems going, accountability systems, and the one that differs from what is working on the level that's acceptable for ESSA is one that's utilized for alternative schools. They've had a very difficult time defining what an alternative school is, because there are many schools that could fall under that alternative moniker. But we did hear from some in our state, and they have developed a different alternative school accountability system that might address some of the things that Brittany was suggesting. For example, in our standard school accountability system, we have proficiency growth, college readiness, and these are based on different test scores and so forth. In the alternative system accountability, they have academic growth, credit attainment, credit earning, improved attendance, the other factors that we know are related to school success. So I don't know if we could somehow meld those two together or put some of those into one system that would help. We had a motion in our meeting to change the weighting of the current accountability system, make a list of options for stakeholders and get their feedback. So we want to bring these people who are dealing with these alternative schools to the table and say, this is our issue. How can we come together in a single alternative or a single accountability system that doesn't harm anyone? By leaving out some of the kids that are in these alternative situations, then we have the possibility of them not showing up or their needs not being addressed. And so we don't want to do that. We want to be able to identify them. We want to be able to make this a process that works for the most people possible and that really shines a light on how we're doing in Utah in terms of our accountability to our public, to our students, and so forth.
Thank you. I'll jump over here. I'll stay on this side. Board Member Warner.
I was just going to suggest that perhaps board leadership may want to meet with legislative leadership to explain that vote that will be taking place and the direction we're headed, so that they have an understanding of what we're doing and the issues that are arising and how we're proceeding.
Vice Chair Brittany, comments?
Just one last question to clarify the alternative school. So is ESSA just asking us to include all schools? Does that mean they have to be using the exact same accountability system, or we can change the indicators?
So the law requires that the states include all public schools in the accountability system unless a determination cannot be made.
Okay.
And that's the opening, I think, for alternative schools, because a lot of those schools are 11th and 12th grade. And so over half of the accountability system is made up of the assessment. So that element might drop out for most of those schools. And rather than just let them drop out of the accountability system, and then there's some invisibility there and challenges there, that there may be flexibility there to include other indicators or other weightings, which the state law does allow.
Okay, I'm not seeing any further comments or questions. We've got a lot of notes, so this is moving to the front burner on several fronts. So appreciate your work and effort in preparing us for this work session, and hopefully we'll be prepared to make a very informed decision in our next meeting. So thank you for your efforts. Thank you, Superintendent. I'm not seeing there isn't anything else on our agenda for our work session. I will say this because I'm not sure if I can respond to it, but my Outlook must have just come up because things that I sent 2 days ago just hit me, and I've been using only texting on my phone. So good news for me on that. I appreciate your work and the dialogue and discussion that we've had the last couple days, and I'm seeking a motion to adjourn. I have a motion. Second? Second, Jan?
Second.
Okay. Thanks, Joel. All in favor say aye.
No, that was Scott. Aye. Hello.
Well, I couldn't